Good afternoon. Welcome to this seminar. I'm Alexander Lambsdorff. I'm the Deputy Leader of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. I welcome you very much to this seminar. I'm joined here by my colleague Marietje Schaake from D66, our Dutch Liberal sister party, who is also the chairwoman of the European Parliament's Intergroup on New Media, and with whom I've teamed up to organize this seminar. Without further ado, I'm going to give her the floor to lead us into the seminar by giving us some introductory remarks, some context, and then to moderate the first panel. Marietje, please.
Thank you very much, Alexander, and welcome to this seminar organized by the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. To give you a little bit of background and context, a year ago, Alexander and I organized another seminar organized by our political group, which dealt with the important topic of freedom of expression and self-censorship in the EU. And we had an interesting panel, as I believe we do today, which included Julian Assange of Wikileaks, at a time when the diplomatic cables had not been published yet, and at the time where not as many people were aware of what Wikileaks was, as we know today. And so we thought that about a year after that seminar, and given the situation after the initial storm of Wikileaks has kind of gone into more quiet, would be interesting to reflect on what Wikileaks has done to diplomacy. And we have a very distinguished panel. We're going to do this session in two sessions. The first panel the first two speakers, which I'll introduce in a little bit, will give you a little bit of context and background from the perspective of Wikileaks and the world of technology, and from the side of the media. And then in the second part, we will hear more from the diplomatic representatives. And we believe that there are a number of important questions ahead of us about what the state of free speech is now, what is the situation for internet freedom, are there many more opportunities as a result of new technologies, or what are the threats that we're facing, and how should we anticipate also in our foreign policy. As liberals, of course, these values are very important to us, free expression and democracy, human rights, and as parliamentarians we have a responsibility of democratic oversight, of making sure that important decisions are made with democratic control, and that information that's relevant to the public is actually available to you. So what is the state of play is what we're going to discuss now. We also have a number of people joining us via the web stream. This entire session will be available live via the ALDE website, and we're using a Twitter hashtag DPWL for those who want to follow on Twitter. Now, first we will hear from Daniel Domscheit-Berg, who is a technology activist and was a spokesperson for Wikileaks. He was not involved with that organization at the time of the publication of the leaked cables from the US State Department, but he has experience with the organization and wrote about his experiences in a book called Inside Wikileaks, and he's now working on an alternative project called OpenLeaks, which he might want to talk about. And after he has made introductory remarks, we will hear from Christoph Schult, who is the bureau chief of Der Spiegel, the German newspaper, who also published some of the cables that were available on Wikileaks, and he is based here in Brussels. They will each speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion with all of you, and we look forward to that discussion. So Daniel, thank you, and please take the floor.
Thank you. I hear everybody can hear me. It's a bit weird with the acoustic in this room because I can't hear myself speaking. But hello everybody. I'm very happy to see so many people interested in this topic. And I'm happy to be giving the introduction. And that's what I'll actually be aiming at, trying to give an introduction that let's say, gives a framework so that we can afterwards have a lively discussion and hopefully be answering some of your questions and debate this whole topic. I'd like to start with looking at the status quo so that we have a common ground of what's the status quo at the moment. And I've been given this some thought preparing for the seminar in the last few days. And I think generally we can say that the world we are living in, and this world where we are now all wondering, are all these secrets that we have, are all of these secrets going to be exposed? This world, first of all, is terribly overclassified. There are many secrets in this world in existence that have no reason to exist. And basically, I'd like to introduce or start with saying that there's not so much we have to fear that could now suddenly all come to light that would really make life so terrible for all of us, or that would destroy the basis of what we are working on, or the ways we are maybe also doing diplomacy. So I think lots of the secrets we have in this world are not necessarily needed. Secondly, we are living in a world that is developing into a globalized world. And with that globalization comes complexity. And this is just, I mean, it's a very simple thought, but it raises one particular problem. And this is why we see this whole debate about transparency at all. It is that people have lost the understanding of what actually is going on. So we have a world that is becoming so complex that I, as a citizen, first of all, don't understand anymore what's happening. And the few people that do understand what is happening and how it works, they have a big tool set of very complex mechanisms they can use in order to hide what it is that they are doing. So I'm not just confronted with a general complexity here, but I'm confronted with people abusing that complexity to hide the things from me that I should be interested in. That makes it, for me as a citizen, that makes it for me very difficult to behave. I don't know how to choose politically, I don't know how to behave as a consumer. I don't know what the consequences of my action are anymore, and I do not know anymore who to support and who not to support. So this is a bit of generally why this whole need for transparency exists. It's also one of the reasons why I got involved in Wikileaks in 2007 in the first place, because I, as a citizen, as a consumer, as a human being on this planet, I just feel that I need better information and that I need better mechanisms that make sure that I learn about the things that I should know about. Whether these things are supposed to be known to me or not is a completely different topic. So secondly, as part of the status quo, I would like to stress that whatever whistleblowing we are talking about and whatever transparency to be created, it's much more than just Cablegate, or it's much more than the Iraq war logs or the Afghanistan war logs or whatever. But it's corruption that is beginning in a small town, or it's abuse of power in a local environment. It is sects or cults like Scientology that are abusing people by using restrictive legal means to repress them. And whatever else there is that is totally undisputed, that we all feel we should know about, but that generally we are not being told about. So we should not forget in all this this trouble maybe that at least a couple of you maybe are having these days with figuring out what kind of information they can still write down and what they should maybe not tell anybody. We should never forget that there is this need for transparency, and that there's just a few corner cases where the question of what should be transparent becomes a bit more difficult. Thirdly, and that is, I think, a happy message after what was expected when Cablegate was published, I see that US diplomacy still seems to be working. So there is a diplomacy apparatus. Diplomats are still in the embassies in the countries they have been in before, and it seems that the world is still talking to each other. So despite all the predictions that were made shortly before the Cablegate release, and despite a lot of the black images that were conjured when Cablegate was actually released, I think it was quite some hot air for quite a while. But to me, at least, it seems that most has gone back to usual business. And this is, I think, an important lesson as well, because it means that even though we're getting so much information sometimes, and it feels like now everything is crumbling down, it is actually not. In the same way that a publication like the Afghanistan war logs or the Iraq war logs did not end the wars in Afghanistan or Iraq, in that same sense, does a leak of 260,000 diplomatic cables not end diplomacy. It just gives us a new perspective, and that's something we should think about, and hopefully that's why everybody's here today. So for some of the lessons learned is something else I'd like to shortly look at to define this frame. One of these lessons learned the lessons learned that I have taken are probably different ones from you, but I'd like to share what my perspective on this whole topic is. So first of all, I think that WikiLeaks has changed a cultural move, a change of paradigm, maybe, so to say, that is underway to happen, and it is a change that has been overdue. It has been long overdue. So we need a different understanding of transparency, of the way we're dealing with information when we're heading into the information age. And we need a much more robust way to deal with information, to consider where we should draw the line between what should be public information and what should just be private. And I think this is the biggest achievement that WikiLeaks has made. It has carried this whole debate into rooms like this one, or into my grandfather's living room, who is at 86 now confronted with the definition of a whistleblower, which is for a German a term he has never been confronted with before. There are only bad traitors to secrets. There are never people that are doing this for a positive thing. And I think this is a very important spark of light that has been changed by WikiLeaks. So there might be the question if this is something that WikiLeaks has spawned itself, or if this is part of a bigger cultural movement, and maybe this is something we'll have to talk about later on as well. I'm not sure how much WikiLeaks is the originator. I think it's a bit of a hen and egg question. But what we see is that there is more need for transparency, and that transparency is something that the people are starting to demand. What we can also see is that there is a lot of big potential. So I'm not sure how many of you have seen what WikiLeaks has published besides the diplomatic and maybe the material about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But actually we have exposed a lot of unethical behavior all around the world. Lots of cases where I think, would all agree that despite this being illegal to tell somebody else, despite this being a secret, despite this being something that's maybe commercially protected or whatever, there are tons of examples where we would all agree that it made perfect sense to publish this, and that it actually was the duty of somebody to bring this to the public attention. So what we today have, I think, is kind of a dilemma where we are stuck between something that is an unlawful right, and on the other hand, there is a lawful wrong. So I think this is, at least from my citizen perspective, something where we have a mismatch in between the definitions. We perceive some things as being terribly unjust, yet they are legal. And on the other hand, we can see things that are illegal, but they would still appeal to our definition of justice, or to what we define as being right. So this is, I think, another aspect we have to look at generally, because we have to redefine certain of these definitions for the future, because the definitions we have won't hold up anymore. So what we experienced in these 3 years was that there was a big potential for an organization that publishes material that others are trying to hide. And to tap into this big potential, and I think this is where Mr. Schult will also come in, there are a couple of requirements. And one of these requirements is, and this is, I think, the most important one, is that you have to have a set of rules under which you operate. So you cannot do that just without any kind of rules that you to enforce on yourself. When we started out in WikiLeaks, we had this very idealistic view that we defined the world into black and white, and there were secrets and there was information that was already public. And we thought that for about anything people would send us, because they felt it should be public, that there would be a possibility to publish it. And in the end, this is, I think, one of the most important lessons we learned, is that there are corner cases where you cannot succeed with such a simple strategy. If publishing information means that you will also publish information about 5,000 people and their credit card details, or if it means publishing information about informants in Afghanistan that might have given leads to the United States Army of where they could find Taliban, then these are corner cases where, with a simple strategy of just publishing whatever you get your hands on, where that just doesn't succeed. And where we need more robust standards by which such publications are made. And this brings us to what I think is at least part of this process for decades already, and that's the free press. This is what traditionally has been one of the most important decisions that the free press had to take, is where to draw this line between somebody's privacy and the interest of the public. So while I don't trust the press, let's say ultimately, I think the press has their own flaws, they have their own economic and political problems, and they're not in the best shape at the moment. I think it would be wrong to now expect that a platform that is publishing just documents could make the press superfluous or anything in that respect. I rather think the future will be that these are interwoven much more intensely, and that both these parties profit from one another and from the experiences they have. So that maybe platforms that can publish information or help facilitate this information can work as an addition to the free press, but not as something that makes it superfluous. The standards for publications of raw information are generally a bit different, and that's why I think there's some debate needed on that as well, because you're not publishing a story that interprets a certain fact, but you're publishing the full fact. And that creates a different kind of requirements that you have in order to redactions you might have to make, or again on where to draw that line in between public interest and the right to somebody's privacy. So in an effort to, I don't know, try to close that circle before hopefully we're at some point in time getting into a lively debate. One of the experiences, and that's another very important lesson learned I'd like to share, one of the experiences we made when just looking at documents and information coming from all kinds of closed and secretive systems is that all of these systems are corrupt because they have no external control. There is no independent control mechanism, no one that is keeping these systems accountable. And I'm not sure how many of you have seen the collateral murder video that we published in 2010 in April, which is this terrible video footage shot out of a Apache helicopter that shows how civilians are being killed on ground in Baghdad. It has one very important facet, and it is not to see how these people are dying, but it is listening to the audio feed. So together with this video, there was a live stream or a recording of the radio conversations going on. And if you listen to these, what you will find is that people are talking to each other in a manner that every one of us, I'm very sure, would consider inhumane, where you are wondering, what has that human being become that is sitting in this helicopter and shooting at somebody else? The thing is, it's not genetics, and it's not the way they were raised, I'm pretty sure. It is that they are operating in a system that guarantees them complete anonymity by secrecy. They are operating in a system that tells them to fulfill these inhumane acts, and if something goes wrong, that system also promises them that it will not expose them, because there is no independent revision outside of the secret classification. If you do not have that classification level, you will not get this information. And those pilots and the people shooting do not have to worry that this information will somehow surface and might be shown on the 8 o'clock news to their parents and their grandparents. And this is quite basically why there is no control and there is nothing that keeps these people human. And this is why I think it's a very plastic example that shows why it is so important that all in all the systems we have, even if these systems partly use secrecy, it is so important that there is the potential for every secret to be betrayed by somebody, to be brought to light, because it keeps us all honest, at least on a very fundamental level, I think. So, and I think with that, I'd like to conclude. This was just a very rough roundup, and I'm looking forward to a lively debate. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for that introduction. We're now going to go to Christoph, if you're ready. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that it's nice that the headline of the seminar is that WikiLeaks dealt a major blow to traditional diplomacy, because, of course, has been a discussion going on that WikiLeaks has also dealt a major blow to traditional journalism. Many actually argue that the traditional journalism has basically failed, and of course, coming from a magazine that has always had a very investigative approach, we can ask ourselves why sources that opened themselves up to a platform like WikiLeaks didn't come to us or to other newspapers. I mean, that's basically it's probably the first lesson. It's basically part of a failure, because if you don't build enough trust, or if you don't give the impression that you are trustworthy enough, then less people open up to you and come with their information. So, of course, as a first reaction, as a traditional journalist, you think, why do you need WikiLeaks for that? But as Daniel has already pointed out, and I can only support that and probably elaborate a little bit on that, the whole development since the first publications last year showed that there need to be traditional journalists in order to work with the material. The discussion, I think, within our magazine, for example, and I probably talk a little bit about how this all started and the cooperation with the other magazines and newspapers on the WikiLeaks material. The question was less whether we should at all deal with this material, because if you look at the material, it's just such a big treasure of information that as a journalist you can, of course, you always dream of getting it, and probably at least in the history of our magazine, there's hardly been such a big treasure of information coming in. So I think the question was less whether we at all should work with this material, whether we should at all publish this material or cooperate with WikiLeaks. The question was more, how do we publish it? And that was, of course, quite a long process. And as Daniel has already pointed out, I think WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks influenced traditional journalism, but traditional journalism influenced WikiLeaks in the same way, because they learned that their initial principle of publishing whatever information that they're getting, whatever document they're getting, as it is, it does not really work for several reasons. One probably minor reason was from the side of a platform like WikiLeaks, is that many of their stories, which were really small scoops, were not really didn't have a big impact, because there was no press coverage, or the press ignored it, or they didn't even know about it. So you need basically the press as a kind of megaphone for this kind of information. And of course, the more important work that traditional journalists do, as Daniel pointed out as well, is to view the material, to select the material, to decide what information you can publish, and what information you better not publish, or what kind of sources you have to protect, or what kind of names or privacy of people. Just to tell you a little bit about this cooperation, it was actually not only in terms of the treasure of information that was published by WikiLeaks, but also in a very technical way, or in terms of organizing the publication, was quite a challenge, because three major international news outlets worked together on this: the Spiegel, the Guardian, and the New York Times. At least on the Iraq and the Afghanistan war logs, and on the cables, there came El País and Le Monde in addition. So if you want to agree with among three such big papers on a publication date, on the material, on basically how you work with the material, it's quite a negotiating process, and that has been going on for months actually. Mainly in London, in the headquarters of the Guardian, where there were representatives of all of the three newspapers, and Julian Assange, and well, that basically went on. It was quite difficult because, of course, of the sometimes contradicting interests. WikiLeaks being there, wanting to publish all the documents, the journalists having their criteria for selecting the material, and of course, last but not least, also for sometimes it became a little bit difficult because of the exceptional character of Julian Assange that made it in certain phases quite difficult to reach a consensual decision. But at the end, that was all agreed, and I think if you only look at the sales of the papers or the magazine, at least with Der Spiegel, it was two of the three were best-selling editions in the last year, and so it really made the headlines, and everybody's speaking about it until today. It is also important to point out that all the three news outlets were completely independent in writing their stories. WikiLeaks had no influence whatsoever on the selection of the stories, and on the if you want, the spin of the stories, or how the story is being told. So and also among the three newspapers, there was no cooperation at all about who writes which story, or I mean, there were certain theme days when you publish which big theme, but you're not the concrete stories were written completely independently by every magazine or every paper. So the question is, of course, how do you, as Daniel also started to say, how do you start working on? I mean, I have some doubts that. I mean, first I have to mention something very obvious. I mean, WikiLeaks didn't change fundamentally the way journalists get their information, because of course there's no week passing by, not before WikiLeaks and not until today, that certain informants, sources, politicians, officials come to us or to other newspapers with their stories or with their material or even with papers in their bags. So I don't, just to get this into proportion, there's still a lot of things going on without WikiLeaks helping it to be published. But of course, it raises a question why people trust an independent platform more than certain journalists, and that has probably something to do with the fact that journalists are torn in between various, sometimes contradicting interests. I mean, of course, if you work with a source, an official or a politician, or somebody from a company, out of a company, you build up a certain trust. I mean, that's not a thing. Nobody comes to you without knowing you. I mean, you're building up a relationship, and of course you're bound by some kind of. I mean, you're talking about the rules of the publication and what material the source wants to have published, and there are certain limits for a journalist that, of course, rely on the or depend on the relationship with a specific source. I mean, that can vary from source to source, but journalists are bound by certain interests as well, and of course, journalists by selecting the material, they also take into account that probably certain people could be, I mean, in the worst case, killed. So that in the case of the WikiLeaks cables, some cables were not published or not used by us or by the other two magazines, whereas some cables the same cables were actually published by WikiLeaks. On certain other cables, there was actually an understanding that that would probably be too much of a risk. So, but journalists are bound by certain they're bound by certain limits. They in a way, if you want to say it, it's in a way something like, you could actually call it corruption in a way, because you of course by getting to know somebody and by talking to a source continuously, you're getting in a way corrupted, because you cannot do whatever you want. You cannot do whatever you want in order to, you always have to take into account the consequences. So that's probably an advantage, or quite sure an advantage that a platform like WikiLeaks has. And perhaps, as Daniel said, I see it in the same way. The future of journalism is basically a cooperation between the two systems. I probably want to end for now by saying that I agree completely with Daniel that the world is still moving. The diplomacy is going on, both the American diplomacy and also in other parts of the world. So I actually think the US was probably more harmed by the reactions to the publication of the WikiLeaks cables than by the actual content of the documents. I mean, if you look into some of the reactions, and including demanding execution, death penalty for Julian Assange, and all these things, I think this reaction was much more harmful than the actual content of the documents. Probably by this I stop. And
Sure, thank you very much. I'm already seeing hands going up, so I'll be there in a second, but I'm going to take the privilege of asking each of you one question after your introduction. I wanted to ask Christoph about this role of journalism, because it's supposed to check on power. It's part of checks and balances in an open, healthy democracy. And I would say there's been a shift in the opinion about WikiLeaks between the publications of the video in Afghanistan of the shooting and the Afghan and the Iraq war logs versus the cables. Some people felt that the cables were of much less significant public interest than the previous publications. At least that's what I've heard here and there. Was there a significant difference in the discussions that you found in the editorial board or with the people at Der Spiegel in deciding whether or not to publish the cables? Or do you think that they're both equally relevant for the public interest, or was there a difference? That would be my question to you. And to Daniel, checks and balances, of course, are a responsibility of parliaments as well, and especially democratic oversight over decisions of war and peace are very, very important. But we find ourselves in an interesting situation as lawmakers and parliamentarians, where the internet has sort of broken through traditional borders, which define the borders of a nation state and the territory of legitimacy of laws. Could you talk about the role of non-state actors, whether it's corporations like Google or other big companies, or whether it's networks of hackers? What is your assessment of their influence on our world, and how can we, when we're trying to safeguard people's fundamental rights and freedoms, make sure that we include them and that we have that oversight over such parties? And I'll start taking questions while you answer.
Well, superficially, you could of course say, and when we're looking at the material, could say that the first two packages, on the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, were, because they dealt with questions of life and death, were more relevant because there you learned about you learned about an American unit that hasn't been known until then. That was basically there to target combatants, Taliban and others in Afghanistan. I mean, that was quite some news, and of course it's relevant, and it's relevant for the public to know that there are secret units like this operating. I mean, it's actually quite a scandal. If you look at the third package, the diplomatic cables, then of course the first impression is it's a little bit superficial. It's more the gossip kind of way, calling the German Chancellor Teflon Angela, because she is, she sort of everything seems to drip off her Teflon skin, because she's, she can't really get a grip on her as a politician or as a diplomat and so on. But that's more in the way. I mean, many of us thought as well. You hear basically judgments that are quite banal, and that have been published by us or by other journalists before. I mean, these were no secret characteristics that wherever the U.S. ambassador in Berlin found out, for example. That's something that But first of all, it also tells you something about the way American diplomacy works, about the reporting by certain diplomats to Washington, to the State Department. So it is also relevant. And of course, there were also some stories in the diplomatic cables, for example, about the order basically initiated by the CIA to spy within the United Nations, including the Secretary General. I mean. That's which is something that is forbidden by UN rules. So that is of course quite a story. But I admit that the first two were, because they dealt with life and death. They were, I mean, at least to my personal judgment, they were probably more relevant and more more important for the public to know than the third package.
Okay, so yes, in respect to non-state actors and other independent groups acting in an international context, so to say. So, well, maybe I should start by saying that generally I'm very interested in very long-term kind of developments. That's something since I was a kid that has been very interesting to me. So looking at not the next 10 years or 20 years or something, but thinking about what happens in the next, I don't know, a few hundreds years or 1,000 years. Will humanity still be around? These kind of questions. The internet that we see today as a tool that we can use, as a technology that is available to us, is part of the next generation of civilization here. So it is a tool that we see today, that we get an introduction on, we get an idea of what it can be used for, we get some first basic applications that we can see. But this is all just the beginning. It's part of this process where we are developing from a world that is divided by national borders into a world that is one in some way, that is a global society where we all understand that whatever I'm doing here has an impact on somebody in a totally remote end of the world. So the internet is the technical application that helps this kind of society to communicate and to exchange information, content, knowledge, to educate each other and, I don't know, to just get closer together. Since the internet, the richest part in the world is about 150 milliseconds away from the poorest part in the world. So we are really close together. And it's a tremendous tool that can help us understand what other people in other parts of the world are, in what kind of conditions they live, what their necessities are, what makes them sad, what kind of problems they need to be solved, and all of that. So this is, let's say, this is the landscape of the next generation. It's a globalized world. Now, in contrast, we have the political systems and even societal systems that still exist that are based on national boundaries. And in between these two, there's a disconnect. Now, as much as I hate saying that, but the whole idea of national borders and all of that, I think, in the future will become void. It's just a matter of time. And I don't even see why it would be bad. I mean, I think we should make sure that we don't dump our cultural heritage, to make sure that we keep some of these old cultural heritages that we have, some of the things that, I don't know, language, for example, is a very important topic, and that's something we have to consider. But in the long run, I think this will not survive, this system, because we will understand that we are all on one planet, and the planet is what defines the boundary. So we are stuck in this situation right now where we have this tool, and this tool kind of forces us into a world that already is of the next generation, that already is globalized, where we cannot match our boundaries into. And this is where, let's say, these non-state actors come in, because these non-state actors in some part are also already part of that future. They are groups of people that have joined for whatever reason to build a coalition. And that coalition spans across multiple nations. It spans across the whole globe. And this can be the international community of technology enthusiasts that are just interested in creatively working with technology, or it can be a transparency movement, or it can be large companies like Facebook or Google that basically have more power, at least that's something that could be debated as well, more power than most nation states in this world, and that have no democratic election process and no other kind of independent control either. So this was described once by Peter Ludlow from the US as a Greek god problematic that we see. So there's one person suddenly appearing, a new kind of human that we see today, that is so powerful, as powerful as a Greek god, and he can't be re-elected or unelected or whatever. He is just in that position. And so I think this is this disconnect that we have to live with, that the future looks completely different from that system that we are in today. And some players are already moving into that system of a future, and we are still here debating on, I don't know, how the transition could look like for us. And I think this is a very important topic, but it's kind of impossible to give a solution for that.
We won't ask you to solve all our problems, but it is something as parliamentarians we have to think about. Are you ready for questions? Oh, go ahead.
Just one more addition, maybe. What I again think, it is very important that we are moving step by step, and this is something that worries me a lot, especially when I see regulation on the internet being planned in various countries, especially in Germany. So first of all, with this anti-censorship law, or the censorship filtering system that was developed to protect everyone in Germany from child pornography on the internet. So I don't want to get into that topic. It's a worthy cause, but it's not the right solution for this problem. And now we're having the same kind of debate again about illegal gambling on the internet. These are two problems that exist because the world is global, and because it's not just national boundaries that make it very easy to control. But it's two examples that cannot be solved on a national level, and they cannot be solved on a technological level either, because it's two problems that exist in society, not in the technical sphere. So I sometimes think the best approach would be to just move a bit slower, and to just also, as a politician, have the courage to accept that you cannot solve a certain topic from today to tomorrow, but that it requires more time, and that sometimes you don't even have all the parameters you need in order to find the solution, and that you just need more time in order to just watch and see what happens. So don't hesitate and destroy something that you might need in the future, but rather go along slowly, step by step, and find good solutions. Sorry.
Thank you. I have already 5 fellow colleague MEPs on the list. And sometimes they know very well how to move slowly, but I'm going to encourage them to speak quickly now.
Sorry.
So I'm going to give each of you 1 minute to ask a question so that we can start the debate. I want to start with Ivo Weigel.
Well, if I have to just to ask the question, then I failed to with my intention, because I wanted to express some of my opinions to this phenomena of WikiLeaks. But I will try to cut it short. Did WikiLeaks phenomena produce any change in the behavior of the world diplomacy and the world politics so far? Do we have any reason to believe that WikiLeaks will change something in the philosophy of the diplomatic service, which still is actually generally a diplomatic service as it was shaped in the 19th century? So the diplomats are trying to find to earn the money with some hot accents and bizarre things, because all the serious informations are not in this kind of diplomatic reports which were distributed by WikiLeaks. This is one point. Second point, I am glad that so many young people came to this debate, because we all had hope when the WikiLeaks, including some with the gray hair, you know, we hoped that it will contribute to the transparency of the politics. But if I'm talking about transparency, I am talking about the big manipulations, like manipulation about the war in Iraq, manipulations about the Afghanistan, manipulations which have heavy impact on the world politics and the world as such, on the world of values. Do we have any hope that and what we can do also, we as lawmakers, we should do something, we should learn something, and this was probably my two colleagues why they organized this conference, to be more ambitious rather than to just to listen to each other but then the third point, with the killing of Assange, I'm afraid that this WikiLeaks project has lost quite a lot. Therefore, it's one reason more why I am very suspicious about it. But I hope I am wrong. Thank you.
Thank you for those words as a former diplomat and a former minister. Ana Gomez.
Well, I could tell you a story I heard 2 weeks ago in Benghazi from a diplomat who had to be doing demarches on behalf of Gaddafi, protesting against the WikiLeaks, and how that actually made him move into the liberating side. And actually, I think we here in this parliament have plenty of evidence that indeed the WikiLeaks have played a major role in fostering the Arab Spring. So that's quite an achievement already. As a former diplomat, as a diplomat actually only suspended because I am an MEP and someone who took positions in very, complicated matters, I must say that I welcome WikiLeaks. I have written pages and pages throughout my career. I have nothing to be ashamed that it comes out. I might have been upset if in the middle of some operations I was involved, this would have come out. It has happened, not because WikiLeaks existed, but because some stupid guy brought out the information. But actually, I have nothing to be, and indeed, this is very useful. And I must say, I felt this as a parliamentarian here in the European Parliament was trying to uncover the role of my own country, Portugal, in the renditions, and was depicted as someone who was lying and being very obnoxious with my own government, my own party. I do welcome WikiLeaks because it helped correct the record and indeed showed that what we were doing was the right thing. Thank you.
Ilche? Yes?
Well, I would like, first of all, to appreciate your efforts, Mariette and Alexander, to arrange this meeting. It's very interesting, and I believe it will be very useful. I have already even an idea to invite some of the lecturers to my country, because there is a very vigorously developing site there called Bevel, the Bull, who is circulating some of the most interesting and important informations from Wikileaks. Then I'm very grateful to our lecturers, because they are talking in a very frank way. I think I understand the motivation of these young people, their purposes, the moral fundament of their energy and of their activity. I'm talking in such a positive way because I'm getting deep and deep in the whole story. I bought last Friday the Bulgarian version of the book, Wikileaks, and because I'm reading quite slowly, I'm in the middle of the book. I find it very interesting, and I'm looking for the next editions or next packages of information with a growing curiosity. Of course, I have my own questions, and in an effort to summarize them in 2 or 3, I will ask you, firstly, do you intend to interview, this is in the field of the traditional journalism, as you said, Christoph, do you intend to interview some of the persons from the informational exchange between the departments and embassies and the other institutions and the military headquarters in order to illuminate something additional from their point of view? Of course, the majority of them are expected to deny, to reject, to disprove, to, but some of them perhaps will make an effort even to produce more details, which might happen to be, again, interesting and important. Second question, what if the counteraction of the affected institutions and persons will include false information in due time in order to mislead you and create a collision between you and certain persons? I'm not sure, but maybe some of them, the heroes of your activity, will be tempted by such a plan to write, to report in a parallel way, as Ivo said, bizarre things from the tabloids, from rumors, from gossips, and in a parallel way, information which might seem to be essential, significant, verified, and secure. This might happen to be a very strong trap for you and for your colleagues and supporters. And thirdly, do you consciously develop a network of sites in the other countries in the world, in the European Union, or they are sporadically developed by enthusiasts on the very field, on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you. And last member of European Parliament, Mr. Kirilov, please go ahead, and
Thank
then
you.
we'll allow for answers.
Thank you. Congratulations to the Liberals and to both of you. Let me ask one question which was not discussed here as an issue, but probably because it's taken for granted, but in my opinion it's quite important, and I'll tell you why. Can both of our speakers, one user of course and one former speaker of the WikiLeaks, confirm that the information coming out of WikiLeaks is authentic, that it's not manipulated? It is quite important because in January in my country, a major weekly leaked recordings done by the police, eavesdropping, wiretapping, which were quite damaging for high-level politicians in Bulgaria, ministers, even the Prime Minister. So far, the reaction was, it is not quite sure if they're authentic, we're going to change, we're going to appoint an independent body to, and actually almost 5 months have passed and we still don't have this information. This expertise is going on and on and on and so on. So this is quite important with regard to, of course, what my colleague Stanimir said, that some might be tempted even to explore sort of manipulating additionally in order to, of course, to make things less acute. Thank you.
So I noted a few points that I would like to tackle, and I'll start with the first very central question, if there is any hope, and what actually lawmakers can do, and what can be done about this whole thing. And that's something I think quite important to mention. Because in the end, you know, I think the core point that we have to think about is this kind of new form of transparency, is this something that we want to cultivate in the underground, or is this something that we want to cultivate in the heart of our societies? And there's a fundamental difference in between these two of what the outcome will be. Because one, if you cultivate it in the underground, you will not be able to control it. Now, I'm not a control fan, and I think lots of things should not be controlled by somebody, especially when it comes to the flow of information. But on the other hand, you have to have some kind of standards to which you live up to. And this is really hard to organize and also to make sure that it's being stuck to if it just exists as some kind of an underground type movement. And on the other hand, I think if you manage to cultivate as what is your definition of society, if it becomes part of the establishment of the status quo, it is what you endorse as a society. And I think this is what we really need, because we all see that there is a positive potential for this, so we should embrace it. And then we should ask the question of what do we have to make, or how do we have to make sure that it doesn't hurt somebody? But you won't be able to ask that question if you don't embrace it, and if you keep it out of what you consider the boundaries of your society. So I think this is very important that lawmakers and regulators and all of these people understand that they have a duty of making this a part of our society and making it part of what we accept as policy. Generally, and then that comes to the second part, in respect to manipulation and rumors and somebody maybe running away with that information and using it for their own purposes. That's again a problem that it only exists if this is part of an underground movement, because you can't control what's happening with this information and what the standards are of how that information is processed. So generally, I can tell you that in the 3 years that I was at Wikileaks, I'm not aware of any fake that was submitted that we did not spot. So we saw a couple of fakes. A few weeks ago, though, I talked to a reporter, and we published a couple of thousand pages from the Dutroux files here in Belgium. And so about a pedophile scandal here in Belgium, and it was a big dispute in the public. No one is really happy with the outcome of this scandal, and there are lots of people that still want to make sure that information on this is being circulated. So we published a few thousand pages of police files. And I just met a reporter a few weeks ago that told me that he had a real interest in these documents, and he started to read through them. And he found at least 2 pages where somebody obviously had changed some information, and that had slipped through. So this is where practically you hit a boundary, because you cannot cover all of that, I think, in one organization. One organization can never make sure that these vast amounts of data coming in all sorts of languages from all parts of society, etc., that you can verify all of these in that one organization. What we need is a robust framework. What we need is a big coalition of different organizations, the media, well-functioning media, and NGOs, citizen journalists, I don't know, people that are reading dissertations and check as we've just seen that in Germany, and check for errors in there or for misquotes or whatever. So what we need is a robust framework, and this framework is made out of organizations that don't want to outsource the responsibility. This is part of a cultural change we need as well, but that take up the responsibility for themselves. It is a question of whether the individual is taking over responsibility and cares about a certain topic, or if we continue outsourcing the responsibility for these topics to somebody else. And then, I don't know, blame it on them if something goes wrong. Okay, that was...
Okay, I'll also try to tackle a few of the points. The question whether WikiLeaks has produced any change in diplomacy or politics, I think it very much depends. I think if you look, for example, at our neighboring region, the Near and Middle East, I think the partners of US diplomats there will be very hesitant in the future to be as open as they were before, for example, about the danger coming out of Iran and the possible military strike against Iran. You know, this was one of the major stories, of course, of the cables. And I think, you know, in these regions where you're talking about very delicate questions relating to relations between states or the question of war and peace, I think you will have a significant change, or probably already have a change. I think, for example, within the Western allies, among the Western partners, I think there's still a lot going on, and there's still a lot of trust, and people change. You know, there are new ambassadors, there are new people on the other side whom they talk to, and I don't think it has had such a big impact on that. What do I have hope concerning more transparency? Well, to be honest, not, because I mean so much could be done already. If you just look at historical files, I mean, in most of the European countries, there is this 30-year limit, you know, after which classified information, historical information, can be published. But I know it is especially from Germany, but I'm sure it's in many other European countries the same case, or even worse. Many of these historical records are still, even after the 30-year period, are kept in secret because some interior minister has an interest or has the power to decide, because there are certain exceptions. I mean, we're talking about records, events going back 30 years. I mean, they don't have any current influence on anything going on currently in politics. So, I mean, there we should start asking the questions why these historical files, after one generation or more, cannot be made accessible in public. I mean, there are other fields, for example. Why, just to give an example out of the heart of Europe, why, for example, the sessions of the European Council, when the heads of state and government are meeting, why can't they be public? Is that so secret, what is going on there? And if they have a little fight about Greece, I mean, this is a very fundamental question. Do we have to keep all these sessions behind closed doors? And for journalists, it's very difficult to actually know what has been going on and what Mr. Sarkozy and Ms. Merkel and Mr. Berlusconi have been talking about. It's very difficult because they even know no official records, even no official secret records. As to the question, there was one question concerning the person of Julian Assange, whether WikiLeaks will probably, I mean, whether he's important for the effectiveness of this platform. I would say, I would agree to Daniel that you need a democratization of these platforms. You need many more platforms in order to have sort of also get a democratic control. However, of course, you always have the risk, if you have too many of these platforms and too many of these organizations, as is a little bit the situation with the traditional press. The competition is growing, and there's not only Time magazine in the United States, and not only Der Spiegel in Germany and in other countries. There are many more papers and media outlets The competition has been growing. They have all become better, I think. They've all improved. So the question is, where, if you don't have this one tower, like WikiLeaks in this field, or like New York Times, for example, in America, do you create enough attraction to possible sources to come to one of these lightning towers? I mean, it's quite a dilemma, because on the one hand you need democratization, on the other hand, if they are all basically doing a good job, but there's no outstanding outlet platform, then how do you basically attract possible or potential informants or sources? That's quite a dilemma, I think.
You have another question.
Thank you very much for both presentations. My name is Joachim Kobs. I'm a professor of political science here at the University of Brussels and director of a civil society think tank called the Global Governance Institute. And we just started last month a large research project on the impact of WikiLeaks on democracy, civil society, and global governance. And of course, there are many, many questions that have to be answered. I mean, there was on democracy, there was a parliamentarian just talked about impact of WikiLeaks on the revolutions in Tunisia. That's one question. But of course, another question is, in Europe, how could the impact be felt on democratization and participation of civil society in Europe as a result of WikiLeaks? And the core question we kind of hit rock bottom at the moment, it seems, is dissemination. How do you effectively get this information, this vast information, out to the ordinary citizen? Of course, there is, you mentioned journalism as a key partner, but I actually think, if I may say so, that journalism really wasn't the right tool. I think it failed in terms of disseminating very many nuanced, interesting aspects of the major leaks, or the leaks before, the big US leaks, as you mentioned, in 2008, 2009, and so on. And the key question, of course, is also, we interviewed a couple of parliamentarians, and they even say, well, it would be nice to consult this, but we don't actually have the time or the resources, even though we have assistance. I also gave a talk at the European Economic Social Committee, which is the body for civil society, and they said it's simply difficult to use the information properly and to use it for the ordinary citizen. So how would you think could this be solved, to involve ordinary citizens to advance participatory democracy and deliberative democracy with this very, very important information, I think, that you produce? Thank you.
Thank you. I would just like to ask Mr. Domscheit-Berg if he could tell us a little bit about OpenLeaks, his new platform, and how it differs from WikiLeaks, and obviously why you decided to create it. Thank you.
Yes, so my name is Joachim Weidemann. I'm the co-founder of Euractiv in Germany and the co-founder of Netzwerk Recherche, an investigative association of journalists. I would be interested, Daniel, to hear from you. What was your experience when working with only a limited number of media? Because this as such is actually a little bit contradicting the philosophy of WikiLeaks, that it's an open platform. And is OpenLeaks going to have a different policy there? That's one question. And as just a second remark, I would be delighted to hear from Graf Lambsdorff how actually, because the issue today is diplomacy post-WikiLeaks. So could you imagine something like Diplomacy 2.0, a new approach to diplomacy where we finally stop pretending certain positions whenever different countries talk to each other, but open up these conversations between countries also to the citizens affected? Thanks.
Okay, great. Actually, all these three questions in my direction, at least, are going to be quite easy to answer because it all evolves around our new project, basically. So I would, first of all, completely agree. Lots of the information that was published just puffed in the air. So there was, In many cases, a few people noticed, especially in the beginning of WikiLeaks. We were struggling very hard to make anyone notice at all. Then we were hoping that out of the few people noticing a publication, somebody would actually take care of writing something about it and make other people aware and give some kind of an introduction. So from that, it developed to a platform where people were regularly checking if something's new, to a platform that started to collaborate with a few media outlets, because it became clear that without these kind of partnerships and without carrying the news about this information and carrying some context into society, without that, most people just wouldn't notice and never care about it. People regularly don't read a 200-page source document if they don't have a reason, and that reason comes usually from someone giving them some kind of an introduction, and that can be a press article. So I would still agree that even though there are some corporations, this is just the beginning, and it's not really making any long-term kind of effect either. Unfortunately, with lots of stuff happening in the world that is really dramatic, we can see that the attention is just shifting every day, basically, or at least every week, from one major incident to a next one. And then we've already forgotten about what's happened a month ago. And that's a bit like what we can see with these cables right now. All the big stories have been reported on. 2 days, 3 days later, most people have forgotten about them. And I think the real value is with historians that can just take the time to dig into this more deeply and then, I don't know, find out how we have to rewrite history at some point in time. So this boils all down to what we thought about a lot. And this is the whole question of how do you disseminate that information. And this is where, with OpenLeaks, we have a completely different strategy, because we believe, generally, you should have as many partners as possible. So you should offer the possibility of as many journalists, as many investigative reporter networks, as many media outlets, or as many NGOs as well, or other experts, subject matter experts, to get access to that material and to report about it. Now you have the problem that you have, it's a bit contradicting to the media economy, because the media economy defines that the media wants a scoop. They will only invest good resources and good reporters and lots of time into a story if they can be the first ones to publish it. So how do you appeal to these things without losing your neutrality? And that's where we have come up in our model with a solution that if you as a source in the future, you know about corruption in a local town, you can hopefully give that information directly to your local newspaper. And on the other hand, if you know about an environmental scandal, you might be able to go to Greenpeace or a similar NGO that we might be working with. So the source can define where to bring that information, because the source actually knows where it would matter. And on the other hand, that makes sure that the media gets some information that's exclusive for them. Now we have a mechanism that allows the source to say the media will only get it for 4 weeks exclusively. And if they don't run their scoop, it's distributed to all the other partners that we have, and some of them, one of them with this dynamic will make sure that they take up the topic. And if it's in the end, in that chain, just one organization that makes sure to deal with all the topics that no one else had an interest in. And it's probably even a story to look at these documents and to find out why nobody else had an interest in them. So this is, let's say, on a high level view how we are approaching this. We want to give as much power in selecting the partners, in selecting where the information should ideally go to the source, because the sources should know. They should be the ones that should have an opinion in this topic. And on the other hand, make sure that the information, once it's there, cannot just be put into some desk and never see the light of day again. And by that dynamic, I think we are creating quite a dynamic network that will enable information to flow and also make sure that it comes public at some point in time. And this is a bit where we are differing from what WikiLeaks is doing, because we are just focusing on providing anonymous and secure submission system to sources, but we're not trying to reinvent the wheel of how to disseminate information. I completely agree we have a big problem with the dissemination of information, even with the state of the media. But that's not something you can solve by reinventing it completely. I think that's where you have to look how to, I don't know, adjust some parameters. So I hope that kind of answered.
First, I'm going to go to the gentleman in the back with the red sweater, and then gentleman here in the front. Oh, I'm sorry. First, Alexander had a question. Yep.
I'll just answer briefly because we have two eminent speakers who can answer the questions on diplomacy much better, probably. Yes, I can imagine a diplomacy 2.0. I would call it intersocietal diplomacy. We have intergovernmental diplomacy. We will continue to need intergovernmental diplomacy, and I'll say something that seems heretic now, and we will need some secrecy there. You cannot simply open up the six-party talks on the North Korean nuclear program. You cannot ask the Turks, when they try to get the Israelis and the Syrians to talk to one another, to make that public. You could, and that's a borderline case, ask the Russians and the Ukrainians to be a bit more open about why the Black Sea Fleet can remain in the Crimean Peninsula while Russian gas is transited through Ukraine. That affects the public in a bit more accessible way. But intersocietal diplomacy is something that we need and that we need to put many more resources in, because I believe one of the big failures of Europe and the West in general in, for example, the Arab world has been that we've been talking too much to governments and too little to the people, to the societies over there. So yes, we need to reshape diplomacy, but there will have to be a certain part of it that will have to remain confidential. Eventually, when things come and are turned into agreements, they come to parliaments for ratification. And then, at that stage, for example, every trade agreement under Lisbon now comes to the European Parliament, then you have a public debate on it.
My name is Thor Olsen. I work with the Zimbabwe Europe Network. I was wondering what kind of discussions you had when you were dealing with cables that came from dictatorships, where there were discussions between individuals, opposition politicians, or civil society actors and foreign diplomatic missions, especially those that were maybe seen as hostile to the government. Because in Zimbabwe there were charges laid against people that had talked to diplomats based only on cables that came out of WikiLeaks. I was also curious to what extent there were any contacts with newspapers or journalists that worked in different environments. I mean, the three newspapers that were the main ones here all work in relatively liberal environments. If there were any thinking around what might happen to the people that were referred to in such cables, or what kind of measures were taken differently. You mentioned in the beginning, Daniel, that there is a difference between an activist or an informer in Afghanistan and somebody who is here in the West. Thank you.
Tassinopoulos, formerly with the European Commission, on the impact of WikiLeaks. Probably one positive impact would be to help to demystify diplomacy in general. For many people, diplomacy is something secretly an activity which is, relates with black limousines and a lot of glamour. But diplomacy is like any other profession, during which a lot of administrative, a lot of routine work takes place. So I don't know how the panel feeling on that. And then as far as the long-term impact, whether finally we are going to get more transparency, whether we are going to have more information flow, depends how the diplomats are being reacting to the WikiLeaks. If the result would be diplomats and diplomacy will be more secretive and more discreet and more exclusive, then we're going to have less information, and then the result would be the opposite of what WikiLeaks wanted to achieve.
Jan Marco Müller, European Commission. I have two issues. The first one, we shouldn't forget that there's also a legal way of leaking documents, and that's the freedom of information laws and the access to documents regulation, which we have on the European level. And these are quite far-reaching pieces of legislation. They even cover releasing emails, for example. And when I worked in the UK, I had an email disclaimer saying that this email may be subject to disclosure under this law. So how do you see this WikiLeaks approach vis-à-vis these kind of, say, freedom of information laws and access documents laws which are existing already? Second issue, and I pick up something what Alexander said earlier, where I see a little bit of a problem is when something is released which is still in a draft stage. I'm a scientist, and in science we have something that is called peer review. So when you want to publish something, first you submit it to peer review to check whether it's sound, and then it's published. It's the same that applies to politics. When, for example, a commission DG drafts a piece of legislation, it sends to the other DGs for inter-service consultation, as it's called, which is basically a peer review system. And if one would, along the way, have to release something, then it's like you go to a restaurant and after 10 minutes you go to the kitchen to see how far the cook is and telling him whether he should add a bit more of this and that. So the question would be, does early leakage of documents actually enhance the quality of policies or rather lead to worse policies?
Shall I? Okay. Okay, so I'll try to make a round there. First of all, in respect to the measures taken to protect people, that's a pretty big question generally. And I quit WikiLeaks in September 2010, so I was not part of the team that published the Iraq war logs as well as the diplomatic cables. So I'm not intimately familiar with how or what kind of measures were taken for these publications. Generally, I think you can see that WikiLeaks is trying to redact documents according to the needs so that unnecessary harm is in some way dealt with or avoided. On the other hand, I'm not entirely sure how practical that is on a scale where you're distributing these amounts of information. So I don't really know. Again, what you need, I think, is the most robust process you can imagine, and that has to be one of the biggest priorities, to build a process that is robust enough so nothing, or at least close to nothing, falls through. In respect to other papers, I know that they are looking for, I don't know, all sorts of partners on national basis, and as long as you don't write anything critical about WikiLeaks, I'm fairly certain that you can get a good partnership going. In respect to the demystification of diplomacy, I completely agree. I think it's always best if if things get demystified and we all understand what exactly is happening. And I can just hope that diplomats are not actually trying to hide, but maybe, as has been said about the diplomatic US diplomatic cables as well, they have proven that the US diplomats were doing quite a good job. That's at least what I read in some statements, and if that can be your perspective, then it's work you can be proud of. So maybe people should just make sure that the work they do is something they can be proud of, and then they don't have too much to worry about if it gets exposed. And in respect to your remark, which I think is pretty important, first of all, there is a big difference in between a leak and something you can obtain via the Freedom of Information Act. So maybe if we're talking about government information, it's true, and some of the data that people would leak, you could also get through the Freedom of Information Act. But you're forgetting, in that moment, you're forgetting most of what's happening in the private sector, in commercial sectors, corporate world, and all of that, where I think most of the really bad stuff is happening. It's not, I think diplomats are more or less fine people, and I'm not so much concerned about this area of the world or this area of society as I am about very high profit businesses, international businesses, especially when it comes to businesses in the third world and stuff like this. So this is where there are some similarities and some things in common. And if we had really good freedom of information laws, I think less whistleblowers would be needed to uncover them. But on the other hand, I've also practically seen that a lot of them just don't work. So we have a Freedom of Information Act in Germany that's pretty much useless, as much as I can say. So there's too many clauses that say that in some kind of exception, it just does not apply. And this is again where we are living in a world of overclassification, We're living in a world where the default is secret and the exception is transparency. And we have to switch that around, where you can keep something secret, which is all right, but only if you have a really good reason for it. And this is what maybe should be checked for. And in respect to the peer review and drafting process, I completely agree to what you're saying. But on the other hand, it's also, there are a lot of examples that show that it's important to get draft documents as well. Because first of all, you can match the final document to the draft and you can see what has been changed, and then you can maybe ask the question, why has that been changed and when was it changed? And on the other hand, it's always better if you get the possibility to get an influence on something that's ongoing rather than the final product. So when it's already too late, it's very hard to reverse something. But if you're seeing, if you get information on something that's in progress and you disagree, then you have the possibility to intervene. And this is where draft documents are kind of important, I think, as well, in respect to disclosure, just because they can help to do something about it before it's too late.
Yes.
Of course, for a journalist, it's a little more complicated. While I agree that I would, of course, welcome much more openness and transparency, and while this information, you talked about the Freedom of Information Act, I mean, in order to ask a question, according to the Freedom of Information Act, you have to know that something is going on. I mean, if you don't know about a certain secret military unit in Afghanistan, and how can you ask about it? You know, that's a fundamental problem. And there's so many things going on that we don't know about, that you cannot ask about. I mean, and for the things that you know, Daniel has correctly described the problems with all these exceptions. But still, I agree that for ongoing processes, I think that then certain secrecy needs to be kept. I've been working for 5 years as a correspondent in the Middle East, and I think part of the problem why Israelis and Palestinians are not finding the right way to a peace contract is that this region is overexposed to journalists and to the public. I think the most successful steps that had been taken and if you look at the history of Middle East negotiations, the best results were basically achieved when the negotiations were kept secretly. I mean, if you look at the Oslo process in the 90s, or also what has been going on later. So I honestly think that there needs to be secrecy, but of course, and that's what I was tackling earlier. I mean, we once an event is over, I mean, I don't think any reason for keeping this secret. It would be very interesting to see, for example, what exactly were the negotiations going, what was going on through these negotiations. Yeah? So in retrospect, I would completely agree. No full transparency, but for ongoing processes, I would say there needs to be some secrecy.
Thank you. With that, we've come to an end of the first panel. And I wanted to thank both of you for your contributions and all of you for your questions. We've touched upon how WikiLeaks, but also more widely new technologies, have upset or changed traditional diplomacy, traditional journalism, but perhaps it was only a symptom of a society or a climate in which secrecy has become the norm too often and transparency has become a challenge. Only last week in the Netherlands, our Minister of the Interior said that the Freedom of Information Act is not a right in and of itself. So that's a fascinating discussion and a clash between journalists, citizens and the government alike. But we do also have an opportunity to reinvent structures and ways in which we interact globally. And I think as governments and politicians, we also have an opportunity to gain legitimacy and credibility again after some of these relations have been turned around and after citizens have become much more empowered. And as Daniel said, the choice to push movements and developments underground or to use their positive potential in an open and inclusive way, I think is a fundamental one. We will have to continue to balance the public interest and information that is legitimately in a private sphere and also the privacy of citizens, which I think are thin lines sometimes. And we each have responsibilities as parliamentarians, the media, citizens, civil society in being a part of these checks and balances. We briefly also touched on the role of large corporations, companies and other non-state actors, which we don't always know how to check on and where the democratic oversight or the transparency and oversight is at all. But in a globally connected world, in our information age, we see that monopolies on who owns and distributes information are broken. And there will be many more diplomats, citizen diplomats, business people, students, people on the internet who will simply share information and become representatives of the societies they live in. And that control cannot really be gained by governments anymore. So I think it's a very interesting time in which we have to take our responsibilities. And as lawmakers, we have to change laws if they're unjust. But we understood the caution to take our time in light of very vast and fast technological developments, of which we must first understand and assess what the impact of our laws might be in order for us to be able to protect the fundamental rights and freedoms of our citizens, which is, of course, the main objective. So I wanted to thank you again, our speakers and the audience, and now give the floor to Alexander to introduce the second panel.
Marietje, thank you. Thank you very much. I think this has been a very enlightening and informative panel. I'm very happy now that we are talking about diplomacy with two of the very top diplomats that we have in all of Brussels. I'm joined here by Bill Kennard, the American ambassador to the European Union. We will be joined in just a couple of minutes by Pierre Vimont, the executive secretary of the Secretary General, of the European External Action Service, to discuss what the impact actually was. Bill Kennard, who's here with us, went to Stanford and then to Yale Law School, became a lawyer, and then moved on to the Federal Communications Commission, where he dealt with the internet, telecoms, etc. Then joined the Carlyle Group and was sent to serve as the ambassador in Brussels for the Obama administration, and has been a great interlocutor on many issues. So you are extremely well placed to talk about communication, technology, and diplomacy. And the question that I would like to throw at you at first is, how has WikiLeaks influenced, how has it impacted US diplomacy? Has anything changed? Is it business as usual? Or have things changed for American diplomacy?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. And frankly, I hadn't thought much about WikiLeaks for several months. And this event gave me an opportunity to reflect a little bit on the WikiLeaks issue, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, was quite a crisis situation for those of us who are diplomats for the U.S. government. And I think the good news is that as traumatic as the event has been, and it's been painful in many respects, I don't think it has changed things that dramatically, quite frankly. In the days and weeks after the first stories started breaking, I would meet with, as I regularly do, with my staff at the embassy, and some of the Foreign Service officers I work with were saying, well, when are we going to get guidance, about how we should change the way we operate, the way we write cables, what we say in our cables. And my answer was, we're not changing anything. I mean, the good news about it, and it's sort of ironic, sometimes you have to go through painful experiences to get news like this, but I think if there is something positive that came out of it, is that many of us in the U.S. Foreign Service are sort of quietly proud because our work got showcased in ways that was never showcased before. And a lot of people who wrote about what they were reading were very complimentary. They were complimentary in a number of respects. One, they complimented the candor in our communications, the sophistication, the depth of analysis, and I think most importantly, no one saw a great conflict between what we were saying amongst ourselves privately and what we were expressing publicly as a matter of American public policy or foreign diplomacy. And I think those of us who work for the U.S. government feel, frankly, good about that. Obviously, we have thought differently about technology within the State Department, how we control access to information, the sort of technical issues that dictate who gets access to what and when. That would be explainable. But in terms of the way we're doing our business, things have not changed dramatically. I think here in Brussels it may be very different from other posts. As an ambassador to the EU, my work is very different from, say, my peers in Yemen, for example, or Saudi Arabia, where very different issues. Here, we're dealing with the EU, probably our closest ally in the world, and oftentimes when we're dealing with the EU, it's not to try to convince the EU to change fundamentally how it does business or how it treats people, human rights activists, et cetera. It's really more, it's a very different conversation. And so I think the role I have here is probably different. I suspect that it has had more of an effect in countries that have less freedom of expression, where people who have traditionally come to the United States government and shared things that would put them at personal peril. I suspect that that has had an impact, but I don't know because I'm really not in that environment. But what's interesting in the months since the controversy erupted, I've talked to a lot of people about it, probably less so now than I did a few months ago. And no one came up to me and said, gee, WikiLeaks is a great thing because now government is more transparent. Of course, they wouldn't say that to me anyway, probably, right, as the U.S. ambassador. But I have had a lot of interesting discussions about where is the appropriate line between what is confidential and what is open. And this has been debated for many, many years in different contexts. But WikiLeaks, I think, as you've talked about already today, brings into very sharp focus that debate. And on the extremes, you have people who believe that all diplomacy should be done in plain view so that the public can have total transparency. I think that's a ridiculous point of view, quite frankly. If you look at many of the diplomatic achievements that have taken place in the past, whether it's the Treaty of Versailles or the Dayton Peace Accords, none of this would have been possible if the negotiations were done in full public view. It's just not possible. Just like you wouldn't conduct your private life in full public view. Although if you look on Facebook, you see that some people like to do that, interestingly enough, but that's their personal choice, and not something that should be enforced on anyone, and so we shouldn't enforce that on governments. The other thing that, it's hard to gauge, even in my post here, whether people would be coming to you to share information with you but for WikiLeaks. It's a question you can't really answer. I will say that just anecdotally, personally, from what I've experienced, and I've talked about this with my colleagues at the U.S. Embassy, nobody feels like people suddenly clammed up and didn't want to talk to us anymore. That may have been happening, but it's not really perceptible. But again, this post is probably different from other places. I think what WikiLeaks does expose, though, is that there is a huge amount of personal trust in diplomacy. It's a relationship business. It's about developing relationships, figuring out how to get quality information, who you can trust to share information with you. And WikiLeaks really, I don't think, has fundamentally changed that. There is a great quote from Edward R. Murrow, a famous American journalist who once talked about diplomacy and international communication, and he said, and I never forget that, and he grew up in the era of the 40s and 50s. He was one of our first major television correspondents, and he said, we must never forget that the most important link in international communications is the last 3 feet, and that is the distance between two people talking. And fundamentally that hasn't changed, but obviously the way that people communicate has changed. WikiLeaks is just another example in the recent phenomena of how communications is deploying around the world. I don't know if you've talked much about social media in the context of this conference, but I think that when the story of diplomacy is written years from now, WikiLeaks will be a footnote. The big story will be the role of social networking media in not only diplomacy but international relations. And we've seen in North Africa and the Middle East the power of social networking and personal media in changing governments and how governments interact with people. And I don't know if that's the subject of your conversation today, but I think that that is one of the more important developments that we're witnessing in these times. So I will stop there and would be happy to answer questions or wait for Pierre Vimont.
Who should be here, actually, yes. Let me ask one question that to start things off. There seems to be an apparent paradoxical situation in a way. The goal of the publication of the cables from the Department of State was to work towards more transparency and towards more access to information. Now you say that the way information is handled inside the Department of State has changed as a consequence of that. So if I understand you correctly, it has actually gotten more difficult even for people inside the department to get certain information that they may have had access to before. So in a way, it's the exact opposite of the goal of the original publication. Would you confirm that?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, what we've realized is that the theft of information, which is what this was, is not new. It's been happening for hundreds of years. What made this so devastating? How are you? What made this so devastating is that digital technology and, more specifically, digital storage capacity made it possible for one person to allegedly steal hundreds of thousands of confidential documents from the U.S. government. And so we, as you would expect us to do, are rethinking how people can connect storage devices to computers and suck out information. I mean, the real story, the allegation is that this young Army officer, who's now in prison, had the ability to bring in compact discs, put them in his computer, and download information as he listened to music. Lady Gaga, I'm told. This I don't think is going to happen again. It's a technical problem. But by the way, in the State Department, you've never been able to do this. The computer in my office and in the offices of most people in embassies around the world is you can't attach any thumb drive or storage device to a computer. But post 9/11, because of some of the analysis of that awful incident, caused us to rethink information sharing. We shared information more widely beyond the State Department and to different agencies. So those things are being corrected.
Nice. Thank you very much, Ambassador. And with us now is also Pierre Vimont, the Executive Secretary General of the European External Action Service, who has a distinguished career in diplomacy after having graduated from Sciences Po and the École Nationale d'Administration, served in London, New York, in Brussels many times, in Paris as well, and was the French ambassador to Washington, D.C. At the time of the publication, if I take it correctly, before coming back to Brussels to be the number 2 person and trying to build this thing up together with Cathy Ashton. Now, we've just heard from Ambassador Kennard that there has not been a directive instructing American diplomats to report any differently because of WikiLeaks. I know that in the German case, the German Foreign Office has sent around a cable asking people to be sober in their writing, so as not to present, possible opportunities for misunderstanding. Have you issued a directive to the delegations of the External Action Service abroad, telling them to be sober and straightforward?
No, not really, but I think they were already very cautious when they were doing any kind of forecast. There was 20 or 30 years ago, a French foreign minister, when he arrived in his new job, asked for an auditor to look at all the dispatches from French diplomats for the last 6 or 8 months, just to see whether the predictions they had put in their dispatches had been correct or wrong. And after working for a few days, this auditor came back to the minister and said, I can't do the job because I've been going through all the dispatches and I've an impossible to find one clear prediction from the diplomats. And they're all too cautious. So I think this is really what it's all about. Could I just add one point? I think coming from where I come, from my trade, what we saw through WikiLeaks, and I'm not saying this because I'm sitting next to the American ambassador, but I wanted to pay tribute to the work that of the American diplomats as far as we have seen it through those leaks. I think this is a very good job, a very professional job, so I really wanted to pay tribute to that.
Thank you. As far as the External Action Service is concerned and the information handling, one of the, I think, paradoxical things that was also part of this debate. It has been difficult in this town to establish a close working relationship between the European Union and NATO. One of the problems that was seen by NATO was that the EU was not capable of handling confidential information in a responsible way, that our information was, too available, too open, especially the Commission, now the service were told that. Now that has been a concern that has of course been voiced, by NATO. Are you securing the information in the External Action Service in a different way? The paradoxical thing now is of course that being, Ambassador, you've heard that many times, that the sort of the leading power in NATO has had this thing happening to it. Is the External Action Service preparing to handle its information differently and securing the information, sort of clamping down a little bit on how available it's going to be in Brussels?
Our problem is, if you want to work with NATO and you want to have good working relations with NATO, they ask for confidentiality. The pressure is on us, of course. And the ES, as we're setting up our system, are very much lagging behind in terms of secured network and secure communication. It's not only true about the headquarters, it's also true about most of our delegations, because our delegations previously were delegations of the European Commission, and on the fields on which those delegations working in the past, whether it be development assistance, trade, etc., they had very little secured communication. Out of the 136 delegations we have at the moment in the world, less than 20 have the necessary secured communication. So that means that as we are setting up and upgrading our delegations, now that they are delegations of the European Union, as we are implementing political sections and doing political reports that have a stronger confidential dimension, we will have to secure our communication, and this will take some time. But you see, this is all part of a larger network. We are now coordinating the work of the member states' embassies in the different world. They can give to us some more confidential information. We build with them a trust relation, and a relation of trust and confidence. If this exchange should be leaked immediately, we're going to find ourselves in a rather difficult situation. And this is true also, WikiLeaks or not WikiLeaks. In France, we have Le Canard Enchaîné, which is a newspaper that more or less every week comes out with some leaks they've managed to do in some of the dispatches of our the French diplomatic service. This happened while I was in Washington, a very important and interesting and confidential conversation between members of the embassy and members of I think it was at that time the Treasury in Washington, was leaked. And of course, for our counterparts in the American administration, that was a rather difficult situation they had to handle afterwards. So one has to understand that whatever we may think about transparency and all the good thing about it, sometimes the kind of information we gather, the kind of news that we are able to send to our headquarters are relying on a relation of trust and confidence that we have to try to keep as much secure as possible. It's very much like what you do sometimes with journalists, you know, when you have the background conversation. That exists, and if somebody just goes against that rule, you'll find yourself in a very difficult position.
We have a question that comes to us via Twitter.
Yes. Ambassador Kennard asked whether we're talking about social media today. Not so much, but we are having a web stream and questions are coming to us via social media. And I think this one you would be most suitable to answer. It is about accountability. You mentioned that there has not been too many changes in the way diplomacy takes place, but the question from one of the people on Twitter is whether there's been different sense of accountability after some of the problems, such as civilian deaths, were exposed through the WikiLeaks. Has that changed anything in Washington? And I wanted to add a second question about social media, since the US State Department is so actively promoting internet freedom also, how there's an anticipation of the dual use or the risks involved with exposing or discussing certain things in a public way, such as making a Facebook group, and then repressive regimes being able to identify that person via exactly the same social media that enable organization of opposition groups or what have you. So these two sides and how to anticipate.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the first question of accountability, clearly one of the most devastating impacts of a leak like this is the literal life and death situation where people who have come to the United States government in confidence to share information about, for example, repressive regimes find themselves in danger because of it. And this is why anyone who witnessed the mass leak of this information should be outraged by it, quite frankly. And the press organizations that reported on this, the New York Times, for example, they were quite sensitive to this, and they were willing to report the information as they were free to do because of our First Amendment and freedom of expression in the United States, but they were responsible in terms of working with the United States government to try to at least screen out information that might put people at harm. And that, I think, is the most devastating aspect of this. I mean, in terms of the impact of social media on diplomacy generally, I think you're quite right. There is an unfortunate dark side of this as well, and we have to recognize that there are some repressive regimes in the world that are using technology to track activists in their country. The secret police in Iran, for example, tracking the Green Revolutionaries by tracking their online usage and whatnot. I mean, when liberation movements broke out in Tunisia and Egypt, one of the first things that those governments did was shut down the internet. And so we're very clear-eyed about this. Hillary Clinton gave a speech some months ago, and she talked about the role of technology in diplomacy in the world today, and she said, we're not utopian about this. We recognize that there is a huge potential benefit when people are able to connect with one another and share their views and express those publicly. But there is a dark side too, and that is that repressive regimes sometimes censor people. They can use their use of technology against them. We see that in China, we've seen it in Iran, we've seen it in many other places. And so, but on balance, we find that overall, if you do the cost-benefit analysis, freedom of expression is a very beneficial thing and something that we support. President Obama has initiated one of the most transparent governments we've ever had in the United States. He's opened our government to public view in many ways using the social technology, the social networking technology that got him elected.
Thank you very much. There was a question here about the merit of having draft documents circulated before a negotiation reaches an end. So in diplomatic negotiations, should documents that are relevant to this negotiation be published earlier so that people who might have objections to what is in these draft documents can voice their concerns earlier? The background, or one of the contexts, is of course that many of these agreements have to be ratified eventually by parliaments, and that parliaments, including this parliament, sometimes have the feeling that once the document arrives, it has been so thoroughly negotiated, it's very difficult to change anything. So is there merit, as has been suggested, in publishing drafts of documents at various stages of a negotiation in order to have more transparency and impact from the public?
I think it's two different questions, if I may try to answer. There's the question of how, if we're talking about negotiation on a document that should be ratified by Parliament afterwards, how can we get the Parliament involved in the different stages so that this is done in an orderly way and they're not finding themselves at the end with an end product and not being able to say much more than yes or no. It seems to me that that is different from having leaks on a difficult negotiation. If it is a secret negotiation, you've got leaks that will jeopardize the whole negotiation as it is going on. And that, of course, depends very much on the nature of the negotiation, because today, when you're having those big summits, let's be honest, sometimes rather boring, with long statements that come at the end, those documents are being leaked all during the whole negotiation. You know, the drafts are all over the place. It's the great joy of journalists to get the draft before the negotiation is ended. And it doesn't hurt anybody, because I don't think it is not too important. So I think you have to take into account the importance or the secrecy of the negotiation. That's the first thing. And the second thing is about getting the parliament involved at the right moment, at the right stages, so they're not finding themselves in front of a situation where they have no more room for maneuver. Could I add a last point, which sometimes I find interesting because people tend to forget that, but during many years and still today, on the archives of those negotiations, we usually have rules of 30 to 50 years before they can be given to the public, and there was a reason quite often for that, for those rules. We tend to forget that, but quite often it was for reasons of secrecy, for reasons of protecting people, as the ambassador was saying, a question of life and death. And we tend to forget that sometimes, as just as if it were some old rule, old recipe that should disappear. But there was some good reason and well-founded reason for those rules being applied and still trying to be applied.
How does the US government involve the Congress in negotiations?
Well, we don't have a procedure like the was inaugurated with the Lisbon Treaty, where there's a requirement to keep the Senate fully informed of all negotiations. And before I moved to the U.S., as I've been in Brussels and watched the Lisbon Treaty implemented, I think that it's still being worked out, frankly, how much communication to the Parliament, when, what is useful, what's meaningful, and whatnot. And I think it will get worked out over time. We don't have a similar legal obligation, but there is a very important practical obligation, and that is that if you want to get your treaty ratified, you better stay in touch with the key members of the Senate, because they're going to have input. And so there's a very continuous and robust dialogue between the negotiators at the State Department or elsewhere and members of the Senate and their staffs to make sure that they are moving ahead with a document that ultimately can be ratified by the Senate.
Excellent. One of our panelists has a question. Christoph Schult, please.
Yeah, one remark and one question. Regarding the drafting process, we talk a lot about the influence of lobbyists. So if there was much more transparency on the drafting process, of course that comes parallel with more transparency on the influence of lobbyists, because of course you can see at different stages what particular piece of legislation or particular piece of definition of a certain good or whatever is inserted at what stage, and you can basically try to have a track record of when specific lobbyists influence the negotiating process. As a question, I wanted to insist on this accountability question by Twitter. I think it was basically meant in a different way. I think it meant whether there has been any accountability by, for example, the officers that were responsible for this for the collateral murder video, the video of the that was filmed by the Apache helicopter in Iraq, where several civilians were killed. I think that was the question about accountability. Has there been any influence in the wake of the WikiLeaks publication on people having to take responsibility for their actions?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that the fact that those incidents came to light certainly created public accountability because they were reported on. But that's not unusual. It's not uncommon that the press reports on incidents that they feel need to be exposed to the light of day. And I don't think that you necessarily need a theft of government property for that to happen. It's happening every day and all around the world, and certainly in our government.
There is a form of diplomacy that would fulfill all criteria of transparency. It's called public diplomacy. Now, there's secret diplomacy, there's the negotiations, there's public diplomacy. In what way do you decide what you move from the sort of confidential area into the public sphere? Is public diplomacy public relations among states, or is it more than that?
I can start on that one. I think it very much depends on the kind of issue you're dealing with. Let me give you an example of what I think should be and should remain secret diplomacy is when you have hostages, a question of hostages, and you're trying to get the release of hostages. Many governments are facing such a situation. We have at the present moment hostages from Lithuania in Lebanon, and we're trying to help in the best way possible to get their release. Of course, you can't say much about that, because if you start explaining all the details of what you're trying to do, it's the best way to keep those poor hostages in custody for the next few months. So there is not much room for maneuver, in fact, and I think that everybody understands that. So that's what I call secret diplomacy, because of the nature of the issue itself that you are facing. Public diplomacy has much more to do, as you were saying, about the kind of diplomacy that precisely can go public without any kind of inconvenience. Whether because it's the nature of the debate itself that needs to go public, because you have to push forward your ideas in public to try to make them known as much as possible. It's more than public relationship. It's now part of the everyday life where you have to push your ideas in the open, because you're defending new ideas about democracy, new ideas about the kind of, for instance, transformation process that is going on, for instance, in North Africa or things of that sort. You're pushing your ideas in the open because that's very useful to do so. And I think that's where the difference lies mostly.
Yeah, I would agree with what Ambassador Vermont just said, and might add that in the realm of public diplomacy, technology has given governments tools that they did not have before. Traditionally, diplomacy has been government to government, governments communicating, negotiating, deciding what they're going to do. But with the advent of social media, it enables a conversation of government to people that has not been possible before in as robust a way. And so when our Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, talks about 21st century statecraft, she talks about using social media tools to communicate more directly with people. And in some ways, this can be very helpful, because you can bypass governments and get your message directly to people, and not only get your message out, but get responses. And that is, I think, a quite phenomenal innovation that governments have started to use. It can be very compelling.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any questions from the audience? If you have any, please, Professor.
Yeah, again, many thanks. I'm from an academic and an NGO perspective, and what I would like to comment on is, in terms of, there was a discussion on, what's the difference between Freedom of Information Act and WikiLeaks. The question that you can legally obtain, for example, many information. I just would like to make a comment that's not really true. Firstly, because you simply can't. Sometimes free information ways and paths are not as straightforward as they make out to. And secondly, because the kind of information that is released, has been released by platforms like WikiLeaks, is completely different. Just an example. There has been one cable for the EU, very relevant, 2 months after the Copenhagen summit, where a legally binding climate change deal was supposed to be achieved. And that showed that the French environment minister at the time openly spoke to the US ambassador, saying that it was foolish of the EU Commission to push for a legally binding deal. Instead, the view is that 8 countries will move forward in future to somehow tackle climate change. That went completely against the EU position. And of course, this information we don't get through Freedom of Information Act. And I completely agree with Christoph Schult that you have to know these kind of things before you can ask the question. Same thing with what has been leaked from the Commission is a draft India-EU free trade agreement. Very important again, absolutely impossible to get hold of it, of course, as an academic or NGO, and to assess the imbalances that might be in the making between the EU and India and who suffers on that side. And finally, I think we haven't discussed here because we stopped with Cablegate, but there is now the Guantanamo files issue, where 750 files of Guantanamo inmates have been published. And that begs the question for a political scientist, the key justification for keeping the trials in the military instead of the open civil courts was, well, there were information we cannot disclose because if we do, then the public will know, or our enemies will know, that certain ways we gather information, intelligence, some risks we don't, or threats we don't want to make public. Well, no, it's all out in the open. Everyone can see the files. Everyone can see how, for example, categorizations of whether someone is a high threat terrorist or not, how that has been carried out. We have the guidebook. So the question would be, now that's out in the open, that there's no more secrets related to it, wouldn't it now be the time to move the trials towards a civilian justice process instead of a military process? Thank you.
Thank you very much. 3 excellent questions. One, the issue of the Freedom of Information Act, that you cannot ask about things that you don't know exist. So perhaps a justification for platforms like WikiLeaks to do what they are doing. Second, on trade agreements, whether you can influence them at a particular stage. I know the German car industry wasn't very happy about the South Korean free trade deal, and they knew they felt they learned about it too late. But is that something? Do we want to inform them earlier? Third, the national security issue related to Guantanamo. Are military tribunals needed really? Because now everybody knows anyway. So both of you have a lot on your plate.
Okay, I'll take a stab at them. First of all, on the Freedom of Information Act, earlier in my career, it seems like a couple of lifetimes ago, when I was general counsel of a federal agency in Washington, one of my jobs was to deal with all of the Freedom of Information Act, of what we call FOIA requests that would come to my agency. And actually, a lot of them are not real specific. They ask for example, all documents related to a particular decision that the agency made between X date and Y date. And you have to go through all of those documents and determine which ones have to be disclosed and which might be subject to some exception for disclosure. And so it does allow people to fish around a little bit and try to get access to information. So, point one. Point two is, if we can agree that there is some realm of communication between governments or within governments that should be kept confidential for valid reasons, then the question really is where you draw that line. And people will debate where you draw the line because people have different considerations. You know, as Ambassador Vimont said, that there may be certain reasons to protect things for 30 years, 50 years. Other people disagree. But that's why in a democratic system, you can have a debate about these things. So if you file a FOIA request and it's denied, you can go to court and have this adjudicated. Third point I would make is that your example about Copenhagen and the utterance that was made there, I'm not familiar with it, but I would make the general observation that just because one person in government makes a statement that's reported does not mean that they're reflecting government policy. And that has been, I think, part of the fallacy that people draw from WikiLeaks, is they read a cable from some embassy somewhere and they immediately assume that that reflects the policy of the President and the Secretary of State, and that's not true. What these cables do is it's a flow of information that is collated and absorbed, and then policy decisions are made based on all this information.
A few couple of observation on the question of trade. I don't know how other administrations deal with those trade negotiations. but I personally have never seen a negotiation where we were about to jeopardize the interest of one corporation and another without having at a moment or another contact with the corporation to be sure that in the end they would agree. Because delegations know that when they come back home, they're going to find themselves in great difficulties. So I can tell you, because this is usually how it happens with the country I know best in the past, it was usually the farming sector that could be under great stress. And I know not one minister in charge of trade from the country I know best who would have dared go against such in secrecy against such a strong economic interest and cooperation. So I've never seen anything like that. It's too dangerous from a political point of view to do that, because one day or another all those negotiators are accountable, and when they go back home they're facing great difficulties. So I think all this seems to me a little bit, creating a big story that has very little to do with reality. On the last point, but I think there, Ambassador could speak much better than I do. But what I had gathered from the whole debate about those evidence related to Guantanamo was not now that they were leaked, but that they had been taken under torture, and that was the reason why. It was the whole question of some of this having gone through those difficult methods of interrogation. That was the reason why it was difficult to put them in public and to go into a civilian court. That was the real problem I heard while I was in Washington. The difference between military and civilian. It was there that the problem was lying much more than anything else. As for your first point about the Freedom of the Freedom Act and the confidentiality, what I detect as we're moving more and more into that field, and when, as you were saying, there are negotiations, the Copenhagen negotiation, most of it at one point or another, whether it be WikiLeaks or not WikiLeaks, was right there in the papers, in the media during the whole discussion, because delegations are going around and discussing it very openly, even if sometimes it happens among member states to be in opposition to the Commission. This is something that is known by all journalists that are there looking at the negotiations as they're going on, whether it be the Doha cycle or the Copenhagen discussion. My personal impression is that whether you have WikiLeaks or not WikiLeaks, today, when you have that kind of negotiations, even if you want to retain as much confidentiality as possible, it's very difficult, in fact, to go along for a long time with any kind of confidentiality. It is very well known very quickly by most of the media that are following those negotiations. And sometimes, to be honest, when you're facing a negotiation where the Commission is doing it and the member states are behind, it's quite often the journalists who go and inform the delegation of the member states about what's happening. That's my own experience.
A very new role for the traditional media there, should the business model, the traditional one, fail. There are two questions over there, please. If you could introduce yourself briefly and be succinct, thanks.
My name's Lee Phillips. I'm a journalist with the EU Observer. I was going to ask something else, but what you've just said there, Ambassador Vimont, was, and I did cover Copenhagen. I was up there, and I've been covering the European Union now for a number of years. And one of the frustrations that we have as journalists is actually we don't know, because we often describe ourselves as a series of blind people trying to describe an elephant. We have a rough idea of what's happening in the room, but we don't know, and the story that we put out there often has different bits of mistakes or whatever, because we don't. And the real danger is that over recent years, as more and more policy areas move away from contestatory parliamentary democracy and towards WTO-like arenas, or the European Council, or the Council of Ministers, or the G20, where they are more diplomatic or treaty-making in nature. We don't have that daily understanding, immediate understanding of what was happening, despite all these leaks, despite this, what you say, the delivery of information from delegations to journalists. That's the problem, and that only through things like WikiLeaks, and not only, but that's certainly an aid to us understanding as more and more policy areas move in the direction of closed, diplomatic, closed-door discussions.
Thank you very much. And right next to you, there's the next question.
Yes, hello, my name is Rafael Portocarrero. I'm just likely I'm a journalist here. I just have a case example. Christoph, Schult, you were talking before the diplomats joined the conference, that you prefer more secrecy, for example, in the Middle East about Israel versus Palestine. A topical example, Bahrain. Would you consider the same, let's say, if we were talking about cables or leaks, EU, Bahrain, US, Bahrain. Same question to Mr. Ambassador Kennard. Just curious about your position, and also Mr. Vimont, because you made a case for, well, that diplomacy is an old recipe. I'm kind of still waiting for a tweet of PJ Crowley, the spokesperson for the State Department, on Bahrain, in the same manner that the US used to communicate about, let's say, Egypt after a while. And then to the end, also to Mr. Domscheit, would he take in cables concerning Bahrain? Thank you.
Okay, so the first question I think goes to you, Ambassador Vimont, about the situation that policy areas are moving out of the sort of open contestatory into the more diplomatic realm, making it difficult for journalists to follow the debates. On a side remark, if Angela Merkel gets her way with, according to her speech she gave in Bruges, we'll see much more of that development, I'm sure. And then Mr. Portocarrero asked a question basically of everyone on the panel, and I would invite everyone to think about that and answer it.
On the first question, I see your point, but I personally don't think that this is a new phenomenon. I think it has always been there. Just think about, you're saying we're moving more towards the kind of treaties that are far away from an open scrutiny. I think that if you look, for instance, at all the treaties that we've had inside the European Union for the last 20 or 30 years, they've all been negotiating under this kind of practice. But what I've always found is that at one point those treaties come to the last hurdle, which is in the European Council. And myself, my own experience is when you used to go down to the media room, to the press room, you discovered quite often that they knew more than you knew as one single delegation, because they had all the, at that time we were 12 or 15 delegations, today we're 27. You have 27 spokesmen who run all the time downstairs to give their point of view, which means that quite often, in my opinion, journalists are better informed that one single delegation shut in its own confidential building, who sometimes doesn't know as much as journalists. I can assure you that quite often I've seen a lot of diplomats running to the press room to know more about what was happening. That's my own experience.
Okay. The next question, Christoph Schult.
Well, as I said before, I'm sort of torn in between. I would not give a general plaidoyer for complete transparency. I just gave the example from a very from an area which I know quite well. the Middle East. I think negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians have generally the problem that they were too much exposed to the public, and they could have been much more successful, and they were in part successful if you look at past negotiation processes when they were kept in secret until a certain point. I think you have, and that's why we journalists are there. You have to decide it on a case-to-case base. I mean, but the condition, of course, is that you first of all get the information. Then you can decide on the case-to-case base. I mean, Ambassador Vimont spoke about negotiations about hostages. I think, and I had some personal experiences in the Middle East, for example, with the Israeli soldiers that were captured in Lebanon and the Israeli soldier which is still held in Gaza. I think I was quite close to the negotiating process, and I think actually in that case, in both of these cases, our and other media publication helped basically finding a solution and a negotiation solution. It's an open secret in Israel, for example, that the secrecy around Ron Arad, the famous Israeli navigator that was never found and at the end he was killed, and that the secrecy and the lack of pressure by the family, the lack of public pressure, basically led to his disappearance. It's an open. Everybody would agree on that. So I think it's a very. You have to decide it on a case-to-case basis.
That's where I would come out as well. These are really case-by-case determinations. When you write a cable and you decide that it should be classified, there's a certain thought process that you have to go through. And you have to think through, literally paragraph by paragraph, whether the information should be unclassified or classified. And that's based on a number of factors. The fundamental one being what is in the best interest of the United States government. And so it's very hard to generalize from case to case. You have to look at each one on its own merits, and even within cases, there are some facts, or within communications, there are some facts that should be disclosed, or there's no danger that they be disclosed and others not. And I think that it's important that people understand that these are very multifaceted and, and fairly, at some level, somewhat subjective determinations as to what is kept confidential and what isn't. Ultimately subject, of course, to review if someone requests the information.
Domscheit-Berg?
Well, I'd also like to follow up on the same kind of argument in respect to the case-by-case basis. So if you ask me if I would publish documents or cables or whatever concerning Bahrain, I could tell you honestly that I don't understand enough of that situation down there to be able to make that judgment. And this is one of the experiences when working for 3 years in a small group on that project that has a global scale, that there are just too many questions where it's too complicated for any of us to answer in that respect. And this is again where I'm back with this point I tried to make earlier, that you need a robust framework as good as possible, and not just one media outlet or one NGO, but as many of them as possible, where the experts can pool their experiences and you come to a solution that you can justify. So then you can even make a mistake as long as you thought about it long enough and as long as you took all the considerations necessary to be able to justify it. And then I think you have a sound basis for making that judgment. And then maybe it can even go wrong, but at least you had a good approach. And I think in that respect, as we've seen with basically all the documents we published, it was a case-by-case thing. No two documents were the same kind of situation where you could say this is where you have to draw the line. That drawing that line is something where we need a framework that helps us to determine that answer.
Thank you, Marietje.
On the question of which information should be published, or the example of Bahrain, I think it's fascinating to see that, for example, in Syria, people are taking great physical risk to run with USB sticks to the border, to smuggle almost out information about human rights violations captured on video, for example, despite the fact that almost all means of communication have been shut down by the government. And I think it shows to what extent information is power in this information age, and that there are less and less monopolies, that even a country like Syria, which used to be able to control via state media what information became available to people and what didn't, what access to information they had, how communications take place, are broken through. But it also shows that different actors have different interests and also have different responsibilities. I mean, in principle, the primary responsibility of a government is to take care of the well-being of its citizens. That's also how it derives its legitimacy of being the government. And citizens, but corporations and governments have very different interests in different situations. And I think that that ultimately determines how the balance falls, but that everybody should be able to be held accountable, whether you're a government that's withholding essential information, or whether you are a journalist that's publishing information, which in turn leads to all kinds of issues. And that accountability obviously has to happen in a due process according to the rule of law. And now that doesn't always happen, and I think that that's a source of major concern, also in the context of WikiLeaks and the treatment of Bradley Manning. I mean, there's a global movement that has concern about this, of a suspect of having stolen or leaked this information. And I think in a broader perspective that we see serious changes in how governments and large power players can be credible. And it depends on the way in which they balance, I think, openness and secrecy. I think it's perfectly legitimate to withhold information from the public, but when it becomes a challenge is when people feel like their suspicions about an injustice have been confirmed by leaks or publications. And I think that that's some of what people have seen. And it makes perfect sense to hear from Ambassador Kennard that for the State Department and for diplomats it hasn't changed so much, because the interest of a state is a unique one. I mean, interests of states can be opposing, and that's a fact of life. So what might not change the reality of one actor in this, or one person in this, you know, WikiLeaks scheme, may have a very different impact to others. But in a globally connected world, we're trying to draw sort of ultimate conclusions, but the fact is that the impact is different for different players. And I think that that's the issue that we're witnessing here. And that's not unique to the State Department or the United States, but would be the same for any government with whom this would happen. And